Welcome everyone to our 30th seminar of the Centre of Research Excellence in Aphasia Recovery and Rehabilitation Seminar Series. I'm John Pearce, postdoctoral researcher at the Aphasia CRE and co-facilitator of the seminar series. First of all, we'd like to acknowledge that this event and our participants, many of our participants are located on the lands of many traditional custodians in Australia. And today I'm speaking to you from Wurundjeri land, where the Aphasia CRE office is located. And we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend this respect to First Nations people joining us online today. So today it's wonderful to be hearing from Dr Sonia Brownsett and Mr Rupert Leach, who will be presenting on the development and testing of ListenIn. Isn't it obvious? You have to involve us in the design phase because we will be the ones who end up using it, developing and testing ListenIn. But before I formally introduce Sonia, I'll briefly cover some housekeeping. Firstly, if you haven't already done so, please join us as a member of the Aphasia CRE community of practice. We welcome people with aphasia, their family, friends, health professionals, researchers and organisations to join the community of practice. Benefits to members include a regular newsletter, updates about events and activities, contributions to research, network opportunities and more. And the CRE is always looking for financial support to continue its work. So if you wish to donate, please see our website for details. Please note today that this seminar is being recorded. And if you want to view this or many of our other webinar videos, they're available on our Aphasia CRE website. Just go to the resources tab, you can find them, as well as many other resources that will be helpful in your work with aphasia. Please engage with us on social media, whether you're on Twitter or Facebook, and feel free today to tweet along and use the hashtag Aphasia CRE. If you have questions about the seminar, during the seminar, please use the question and answer function on the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen, rather than the chat box. You can enter your question for Dr Brownsett at any time throughout the presentation, and you'll be able to see other questions asked by people listening in. If you like their question, you can hit like or upvote to show those questions of most interest to the group. Dr Brownsett will answer as many questions as time allows at the end of the presentation, but please reserve that Q&A space for questions only and no other comments, and try to keep the question brief. Now my privilege to introduce Dr Sonia Brownsett and Mr Rupert Leach. Mr Leach is based in the UK, so given the time difference, it wasn't possible for him to join us live today. Rupert Leach has a background in news and content production for world-leading news organisations, including the BBC and Reuters. Following a stroke, Rupert has tirelessly contributed to aphasia research, both as a participant and more recently as a research team member. He was a successful co-applicant in the NIHR-funded project ListenIn. He has an excellent track record of involving and engaging the public in his research, winning prizes at stroke conferences for this work. Dr Brownsett is a UK-trained speech pathologist and neuroscience researcher. Sonia completed her PhD at Imperial College London, where she investigated the contribution of domain general brain networks to the recovery of language after stroke. As a postdoctoral fellow at UCL, she co-developed and tested ListenIn, an evidence-based therapy app that uses gamification techniques to deliver a high dose of aphasia therapy. She's currently a CRE postdoctoral researcher based at the Queensland Aphasia Research Centre, where she leads the Neurobiological predictors theme. Her current research interests include the different structural and functional aspects of the brain that impact on recovery of language, the use of neuromodulation techniques to support language recovery, the optimization of pre-surgical language mapping protocols, and the systematic evaluation of dose in aphasia rehabilitation. Sonia's research currently focuses on aphasia after stroke, epilepsy, and brain tumours. So Sonia, I'll hand over to you now.
Oh, hello. Can you see that? Okay.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, perfect. Hello, and thank you for that welcome, John. As John said, I am going to be talking to you today about the development and testing of ListenIn. I am calling this a co-presentation with Rupert Leach. Rupert has developed this presentation with me, decided what content we wanted to deliver, and he's also pre-recorded some contributions, but it was not possible for him to join in person. But I think it is really important to acknowledge that this is a co-presentation with Rupert. Our title, isn't it obvious you have to involve us into the design phase, because we will be the ones who end up using it, developing and testing ListenIn. We very much want to focus on that aspect. So the involvement of people with aphasia in the development of ListenIn. I will briefly go over what ListenIn is and why it was developed and the clinical trial aspects, but our main focus with Rupert today is on the involvement of people with ListenIn. If you do want questions about the randomised controlled trial, please reach out to me, and I would encourage you to read our publication about that. Before we move on to the content, I just want to briefly acknowledge the rest of the team, because this is by no means a two-man show. On the right is the publication with all the co-authors, all of which contributed, and ListenIn wouldn't be here without those people. And on the left is the day-to-day team that developed ListenIn, and were employed on ListenIn. So we've got Alex Leff, myself, Victoria Fleming, who was the PhD and lead research assistant, Anna Crasson, and Rupert Leach. So in terms of why we developed ListenIn, there is equivocal evidence as to the effectiveness of auditory comprehension therapy in aphasia, or there was at that time. And one of the dominant features of those studies was that they delivered what we considered to be a relatively low dose of intervention, so between 4 and 28 hours of therapy. And this was coupled with emerging evidence that a higher dose of therapy was required to see improvement, and namely the Bogle meta-analysis, where she suggested that 98 hours of impairment-based therapy was required. So we wanted to see whether auditory comprehension could be improved, and we wanted to do this by delivering a high dose of therapy. But two very important significant challenges needed to be addressed in order to deliver a high dose of therapy and see if auditory comprehension could be improved. The first one that we're all familiar with, which is the limited speech and language therapy resources available. But the second is if you're considering 100 hours of impairment-based therapy, that does become quite repetitive, often tedious, and for some people quite boring. So patient motivation and engagement is also a big consideration. So for example, I'm bearing all here with my PhD software that I developed, which I thought at the time was quite sophisticated. Obviously my perspective has changed somewhat. And at this time I was trying to get people to undertake the maximum dose that had been delivered at that time, which was 28 hours. So I was asking people to do 30 hours of therapy. And it was very repetitive. The tasks were pretty much the same, but delivered in slightly different ways. And these were the responses that we got. So too much, the same, and the same, and too much. So these were participants with aphasia that undertook my intervention. I like choosing when I do the homework, but so much and boring. Need to be more like a game, so I don't want to stop. Boring. Good, yes, helping, but listen, press, too much, all the time, nah. And this was where I first met Rupert. So Rupert was a participant in this study, and he and I spoke at length about the need to make a high dose intervention more engaging so that people could sustain their motivation. And this idea of gamification, which wasn't ours by any means, but was something we talked about as a means to provide the potential opportunity to maximize that dose by maintaining motivation. I should add here that, of course, we don't know what maximal doses should be, and there's a lot of people within the CRE that are working on that question specifically, but what we're operating with ListenIn was the concept that a high dose was needed. So what was ListenIn? ListenIn is a therapy. So this is a pre-standard auditory comprehension word to picture matching intervention, paired with gamification strategies, both separate to the therapy, but also embedded within therapy, that in order to link it to the game. The game operated as a motivator, as I've said, but it also operated as a break and a bit of respite from the intervention. And we did want the game to function independently of the therapy, in that rewards delivered during the game wouldn't be dependent on success, but engagement. So it didn't matter how well the person was doing, but what did matter was whether they engaged. And there's some features of the app. So there's 800 unique lexical items and over 3,000 unique challenges. So the difference between the items and the challenge is that, for example, I might be a lexical item, but it might occur in 3 different challenges. So you might have the eye, the blue eye, or the man wore glasses over his eyes. We had very high quality pictures and images, and over 4,000 high quality audio recordings of both male and female, young and old voices. In terms of difficulty, there were various different parameters we used to manipulate difficulty. We had frequency and concreteness as our 2 psycholinguistic variables that we manipulated. The number of foils that were used altered, as did the closeness of those foils, so whether they were semantically close or distant, and whether phonologically close or distant was manipulated, and the type of linguistic construction used. So, for example, with single nouns, we went from the single word to the phrase to simple sentences and through to complex sentences. And then background noise, and this was a contribution that developed from Rupert's input. But this idea that we all know that when we're working with someone with aphasia in a clinical setting and it's nice and quiet, they can often do the task reasonably well, but when that's translated into the real world where there's background noise, it suddenly becomes much more challenging. So what we did was, once people had reached a certain level of success in the app, then we introduced this background noise with varying degrees of signal to noise ratio, depending on how well they were doing with the noise. And there were numerous different settings that we used. So we had the pub, we were in the UK, so it had to be the pub. There was park settings, there was office settings, railway. So various different scenarios where people might find themselves, and that background noise came in on top of the task that they were doing. So just briefly, in terms of the design of the trial, it was a randomized controlled crossover design, which meant that we had 5 assessment sessions, each separated by 12 weeks. And we did do brain imaging, and that is in the paper. And people will be surprised to hear that I'm not going to talk about brain imaging, because it is something I do like to talk about. But that's not going to feature in this talk. So please do go to the paper and read that. And we did find some very interesting results. We had 2 groups. Group 1 started off at time point 2 with the ListenIn block therapy, which was 12 weeks. We asked them to do 100 hours of therapy. And then at time point 3, after assessment, they swapped to a standard care block. And then group 2 did the opposite. So they started on the standard care block and then swapped over to the ListenIn block. So they acted as their own controls, and then comparisons between the groups could also be made. So in terms of our results, here we've got the group 1 results. So you can see in the solid grey line, we've got the performance on trained items within the auditory comprehension test, which was a test that was developed specifically to look at treated and untreated items within the ListenIn. And then we've got the dot hashed line, which was the untrained items. And as you can see in group 1, during their therapy block, which was time point 2 to time point 3, there was a significant increase in performance on those trained items. And then for group 2, we see a very similar pattern, where they received their therapy block time point 3 to time point 4. And we see that significant increase for treated items, but not untreated items. So The significant interaction we saw was very much driven by the improvements for trained items, and we saw no improvements for untrained items. The mean dose delivered was 86 hours, which was by far the largest dose that had been delivered in the literature to date, but wasn't the 100 hours that we'd endeavoured to do. We had an average improvement of 11% with a Cohen's d of 1.12, which is considered a large effect size. And importantly, the maintenance of these effects, or these effects were maintained rather, for up to 6 months in group 1 and for the 3 months that we monitored in group 2. So that was ListenIn. That was what we managed to do and what we showed, and it's now available for people to use. And we're using it quite a lot here at Quark, for example, and the Queen Square group is also using it. But what I want to focus on now is the development. So it's a bit back to front, but now you know what we developed, I want to tell you about how we actually developed it. So specifically, how we involve people with aphasia in our research. So we did this in 2 ways. First, we had a lived experience expert as a member of this research team, which was Rupert, who's presenting with me today. And then we conducted some focus groups, which was really to steer the development of the actual product prior to clinical trial. And this was really important to make sure that the product we put to clinical trial, we were very confident was the best product we could deliver. So first of all, talking about the lived experience expert. This is Rupert, and as John's introduced him already, some of this might be a little repetitive, but the skills that he brought to the listening group were very much, there were many skills, but some of the main ones that he wanted to talk about today are these, that he had this wealth of experience of using existing apps and programs. He was very much engaged in actively seeking out therapy apps to help improve his language after his stroke. He suddenly found himself with considerable amount of time and not enough access to therapy. So that was a big motivator for him. He also had expertise in living with aphasia and the other consequences of the stroke and what that actually meant for engaging with some apps or programs that might be available. And his previous employment in the field of journalism and producing electronic content actually proved very useful for the development of software like ListenIn. His motivation, they were twofold really. He felt that the apps that were available were boring, and you'll hear from him later telling you just that, and that they could be improved really quite easily, with gamification being a potential for that. And he wanted more therapy, so he wasn't getting enough therapy, even though he was one of the lucky ones who was accessing more therapy than most, but he still didn't feel this was enough. Rupert was involved in the entire research process. It was really quite impressive to see the scope of his involvement and how that grew as the study developed. So he was, as you've heard, he was involved at the beginning in developing the research question with me, and then as the wider group with Alex leading it. And then he was involved in applying for funding. So in terms of grant applications, he actually attended the NIHR interview panel. And for those of you who have sought funding in the UK, you probably imagine how intimidating that is. Most funding is awarded after an interview, and they can be a very broad panel with very little expertise sometimes in your particular field. He also conducted the research, so he was involved in the planning, therapy stimuli evaluation, and the prototype development, including the focus groups, which we'll talk about later, and then the dissemination of the research. He's been heavily involved in that since. So, before I go into that one, so Rupert and I have spent the last couple of weeks meeting up at times that were convenient for Australia and the UK, which was a challenge in itself, and practicing and rehearsing and discussing what he wanted to deliver in this presentation. So we've got a couple of pre-recorded videos for you, and the format that we felt worked best for him was a question and answer. So I ask a question and Rupert responds. Some of the points he doesn't get out verbally, so we've got on the slide for you to see as well. Okay. So Rupert and I have known each other since 2007 when he was involved in some research studies that I was conducting in London. And that seems like an awful long time ago, but I remember very clearly sitting in Rupert's living room in a home visit and him giving very brutal feedback about the quality of the therapy software that we'd been using, which was how, from my perspective, you became involved in our research study. But it'd be good to hear from you, Rupert, why you became involved in the project that would become ListenIn. So you were involved from the very beginning, and it'd be great if you could hear why you were involved.
I think there's no real decent software for help people got aphasia before. It's like so dull, so old-fashioned pictures, and it was so dull. We thought the best to get a new software which would be as a fun and like a games, and we also there's no online software to help people. There was nothing at all.
Okay. And what about the amount of therapy you received? Was that something that motivated you to become involved?
I think there's about one or two software which evolved. Was expensive, and it's so very old software. It's like it's for all people, or it's going.
Okay. Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Rupert. Now, how were you involved in the research? So you were involved in the very beginning, developing the actual research question with some of the feedback that you gave me about the software I'd used. How else? So how were you involved in the grant and the interview?
Well, I think the first thing is the grant application to help for the software of the aphasia. The main aim of the grant is to build a new software to help people with lots of for aphasia, and have a games to much more stimulation for the games. It's the interviews of the grant was hard, half an hour interviews, but the interviews with the people who didn't interview me, they kind of sound the words aphasia. They only haven't actually ever seen the words aphasia.
Mm.
It's very interesting actually, but they can't got the idea of the words.
Yeah, I think that's really important, isn't it? So so that the audience know the interview process for the NHR were that there was a panel of how many people were in the interview? So Rupert and I have known each other since 2000. so that the audience know, the interview process for the NHR were that there was a panel of how many people were in the interview, Rupert, was it?
Well, eventually was 6 or 7 in the group, which is it's a large group, but actually for a group of the software size was about 5, and there's the grant personal people are separate group really. Group.
Yeah, so that was that. It must have been quite an intimidating process for somebody with aphasia, but also quite confronting for the panel to be confronted by someone with aphasia and forced to understand the impact that aphasia has on communication.
They can't understand the problem, really.
Yeah.
It's a bit obvious, but they can't. They don't haven't seen the people got aphasia. That's all.
Yeah, absolutely. And then another way that you were involved in the research was that you actually presented some of the work with us at some conferences. Do you remember presenting the work?
Right. Sorry again.
So you helped present some of the work at the conferences.
Oh yeah. With the large notice about the aphasia.
Yeah.
And writing a online of my experience of the aphasia and the software, and research for the games of the software.
Yep. And then, of course, you were involved in the whole research progress throughout as the app developed. So you attended the meetings, every meeting we had. You helped out the focus groups, and you were also involved in the stimuli development as well.
Yeah, it's like a job, like a real job.
Yeah.
You have to 3 days a week for doing the helping the software, also doing the find a pictures of the research of the words and the pictures, and which hard work.
Yeah.
And also to show the person doing the software what's the real problem of the aphasia.
Yeah.
They got it eventually, got it, but it's hard for them to have seen the new words of aphasia.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was a big challenge, wasn't it? Yeah. The software team understanding what was needed to support people with aphasia. Brilliant. And so that leads us nicely into this slide where I want to ask you about some of the challenges that you experienced being involved in the team. So there was a lot of them, but maybe just talk us through a couple of some of the challenges. What was hard about being in the research team?
Okay. I haven't got a science background, and the writing of the science writing was a different language. It's like a odd language, but I think eventually got it, but it's odd. Writing, also speaking, and to help me is to small groups of the doing the software, and also in the pictures and the ideas. Have to getting less jargon, really.
Mhm.
And just also just stick the subjects for 2 or 3 things, and not get a large groups or sorry, slow down.
I think that's great, and I think the agenda is one of the things that I learned the most about your involvement, is that how much we move away from the agenda, and how important that agenda is to support you understanding what's going on in the meeting and following the thread of the conversation. So I think that for me was one of the most important things. And the job.
Yeah, that's when well, I think I was lucky to get a decent group to understand the problem.
Mm.
And without a group with just like a experience of the aphasia, and also it's
yeah.
Start again.
Can you maybe tell us some of your top tips for involving people with aphasia in research?
No, I think first thing is the meet in mid-morning games, and I'm more alive and more aware. Secondly, just stick to the agitations of the subject.
Mm-hmm.
That's easier and simple. Also, just get a list of things for in advance of the meeting. Mm-hmm. Also a small group or a square area of the meetings, and ask the other people in the room. You can get slow down the meeting of the words. It's so hard to for me, and I think that's all, really. That's all.
One more thing that you wanted to talk about was the noise, the quiet space.
Yeah, that's the quiet space. It's very good, very helpful for me, and it's important to get it right.
Mm, yeah.
And without noisy room, and like a normal small room with soft.
Yeah. No, I think we know exactly what you mean, Rupert.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Awesome. So is there, just before you go, can I just ask you one last question? Did you enjoy working with ListenIn as a member of the research team? How was it?
Fantastic. You know, it's like hard work, but it's fun. I was involved with doing the software, building the software, which I love, and also to help in the trials of the other persons who've got aphasia, and the scans of the other people in the rooms. It was an interesting time to do it, doing the software, and it helped me as well.
Brilliant. All right. Thank you ever so much for your time, Rupert, and thank you for contributing. Okay, so that was Rupert talking to us about his lived experience, expert role in our research team. So once Rupert was well established within that team, the next element of patient involvement in our research was the focus groups that we used to steer the development of the product prior to clinical trial. I'm just going to talk a little bit about this. So the rationale for using focus groups was really that we decided that we wanted to develop this app, we wanted to use gamification, but we have this problem, which is that the typical stroke population, certainly when we did the study, is not the typical gaming population. Now that will obviously change as the current gamers get older and we start seeing a younger demographic, that demographic moving into the typical stroke population. But at the time, and even currently, I think that's still true. So there's a lot of questions that we had about how to ensure that the product that we developed was the most suitable. Remembering that the ultimate aim here is to make sure that the product we take to the clinical trial, which is ultimately a therapy, but embedded within gamification to ensure we maximize the dose, is the best product we can use, sorry. So to that end, we had these questions. We had many questions, but these were some of the main ones that we wanted to address within a focus group process. So what people with aphasia actually wanted from a therapy app, were we kind of going down the right route here with gamification and therapy and the idea of engaging and motivating high dose? How usable were the apps for this population? How familiar were people with gaming apps? There's a range of gaming apps available, and although they're not the typical stroke gaming population, gaming apps and games are widely used by older people. How motivating and enjoyable tablet and phone-based games were, and what medium we needed to deliver our game app on, and what level of gaming should be used. This was a really interesting one with the software company who were used to using quite high level strategic elements to gaming to make it more fun and more engaging. But was that appropriate? Was it better to have easier and more enjoyable elements? So none of these questions we could really answer without people with aphasia contributing to our knowledge here. So what we did was we had an 18-month period of product development, which started off with an idea and the prototype development. And then that was subjected to a series of focus groups, which was iterative in nature. So the prototype was developed. I'll talk about that a little bit. But once we had a product that the focus group and the research team were happy with, that was then subjected to internal and external testing before it went to clinical trial. So in terms of that first stage of brainstorming initial prototype development, that involved the whole research team, which was the researchers, the patient expert, and the game developers. And what we knew about what we wanted was that the game had to support the therapy engagement, but reward engagement and not success of therapy. That was important for us, as I've mentioned. The game was to be used as a break from therapy, as well as a motivator. And that during the therapy, we wanted to minimize the distractions so that the focus was on the therapeutic elements of that aspect of the app. So with this, we developed a prototype, which we of course thought was great, and were subsequently told by the focus group it wasn't so great. We took the prototype to testing with the focus group, and this began this iterative cycle of evaluation of the data that we collated from the focus groups, to a redesign of the prototype and implementation of bug testing of a new version, which was then subjected to a subsequent focus group, and so on. This went around 5 focus groups in total, but we did have 2 periods of home play. I think it was, let me just check, it was, yeah, between sessions 2 and 3 and 3 and 4, the participants in the focus group took the app home, or the tablet home with the app on it, and that was really to look at that extended play period, how they managed in terms of usability of the software and hardware, but also whether things started to make a little bit more sense as they were given more time to use it. And importantly, to look at the independent use, because this important element for us was that people could use ListenIn independently and weren't reliant on speech pathologists or people at home to support their engagement in the app. So in terms of some of the barriers that we encountered in the focus groups for participants, there were of course many, but these are just the ones that Rupert and I wanted to focus on today. I do want to emphasize that what we're talking about here is focus groups of people with aphasia, specifically for designing software. So there's a wealth of work out there looking at focus groups with people with aphasia specifically, but ours is looking very precisely at using focus groups for software development, such as ListenIn. So one of the biggest barriers was the noise. It was a focus group approach, which meant they were reasonably large groups, between 6 to 9 people in the groups. And that, as we know, we've already discussed today, can often be a problem for people with aphasia. So there was constant background noise, which was hard for people to engage with the questioning more than anything. When they were using the app in the sessions, they were all given headphones, which again was also part of us looking at usability, but did help alleviate that noise problem. There were multiple conversations going on a lot of the time in the focus groups, which again, coupled with the background noise, was a problem. And I think people found that a particular challenge to this focus group approach. As did the speed of conversation. There was a range of abilities of language and participation within the group. And so there was, if you like, there was a almost average speed that was conducted by the facilitators. I should say the facilitators were not the research team, but the research team were there to support any questions. The duration of the focus groups is always a tricky one. And I think this was an issue that came up as well in terms of kind of the meeting element of working with the patient expert, because of course you want to allow more time for the people with aphasia to ensure that they can participate fully, but you don't want that time to drag on so much that they're fatiguing and that the session's too long. So we were quite flexible with our timing, but the optimal time for us was a 40-minute session followed by a 20-minute break and then another follow-up 30-minute session. And we were lucky, we worked with Connect, which was a communication charity in London, and we were using the room beside their network group, and so the participants went back into the Connect social setting and had a really nice break from the focus groups. And then the group conversation. So it was a very mixed, as I said, cohort of people. So we had different ages, we had different abilities, different experience of using apps and computer software. We also had different levels of language and aphasia. So some of the challenges for the facilitators were, firstly, that we found out quite early on that we needed multiple facilitators, and almost one-to-one, not quite, but almost one-to-one, to ensure that every member of the team was able to contribute fully, given that a lot of the team members, obviously, the participants rather, needed lots of support with their communication. So we had this range of language skills, but also the range of contributions. And we always have people who are naturally want to contribute more and others that step back. But if that's not in tune with their language abilities, then facilitation is really important there. The jargon, the software jargon, Rupert spoke about this quite a bit earlier, but the amount of jargon involved in developing a software like ListenIn is really quite remarkable. And for the facilitators to be able to quite rapidly and online work with that, so that the people with aphasia were able to understand what questioning was getting at, was really quite difficult, I think, at times. And then some adaptations, which kind of isn't really a challenge, I suppose, and given that a lot of the facilitators were experienced with people with aphasia or speech and language pathologists, it was kind of quite intuitive for them, but moving away from the traditional open question approach to focus groups was something that needed to be done to ensure everyone could participate. So in terms of the successes of the focus groups, these were, again, the ones that Rupert and I think were the most dominant, but again, there were many. Educating the research and the software team. I think one of the highlights of the process for us was when the software team came to the focus groups, and everything that we've been trying to explain to them about the limitations of things that they wanted to integrate into the gamification element just became clear. They understood what we were trying to address. So that was a really good learning experience for them, but also for the research team, who were quite experienced with working with people with aphasia. So many things came up that we hadn't even thought of. So it was a really informative process for us. One of the big successes is obviously the fact that these experts, these people living with aphasia, were able to highlight the challenges and limitations of the app. They had a room full of experts who developed this, and they were really able to quite rapidly illustrate the many flaws that were in it to begin with, and then contribute to ensure that it was a really good product to the end. Another really good success was that all participants contributed, and that did require that real flexibility at the beginning to ensure that we had maximum facilitators available to ensure that we could support communication and contributions. And this all ultimately led to this optimal user-led product being developed, which was our ultimate aim, that we would be confident that the product we were taking into the clinical trial was going to be the best one we could develop. So just quickly, because I see the time's running out, some important considerations here. We've talked about time flexibility, so allowing sessions to be shorter or longer and not really having to stick to that agenda. That was really crucial. So using total communication strategies that speech pathologists are very used to, but some facilitators might not be, such as using rating scale and using closed questions, turn taking, etc. Providing that extended period of playtime was really important for our app. It's not to say it will be important for all software, but certainly for what we were trying to achieve, it did help. And as I said, inviting the software developers to the team, and Splitting into smaller groups, again, not typically done in focus group methodology, but that really helped people with aphasia be able to express themselves. And just to finish, because I am running out of time, I won't finish all my slides, but these are some of the responses from people within the focus group on their perspective on why it was so important to be included in the development. So I'm just going to read these because I think they do summarise our thoughts. So, isn't it obvious you have to involve us in the design process because we're the ones who end up using it? If you don't involve us in the development, then how do you know if it's fit for purpose? To start with, it was no good, then gradually, to the end, it's better. It was useless in the beginning, but then we made it better. You need us to make it better. Sadly, I have lots of spare time and it's fun and interesting. It's so important. Everything so far is okay, but it's boring. You need people who know how boring or it won't work. So I've got a longer summary, but that's the main point I want to make, is that involving people with aphasia in gaming application development is feasible and essential, and it allowed us to make sure we had a robust resource to take forward into clinical trial. So there we go. So that's the paper. Please do read the paper and reach out if you have any questions. And hopefully I've left a little bit of time for some questions now.
Yep, there's still a few minutes. Thank you so much, Sonia and Rupert. It's such a wonderful example of how research should be, built with the people who are going to use it and not for them. So, and thank you to you and Rupert for arranging the recording, even though Rupert's probably asleep right now in the UK. It was great to hear from both of you. So if people would like to pop any questions they have into the Q&A box, we can read them out. I have a few to start. I'm just interested, Sonia, in when Rupert or the focus groups maybe challenged what you had envisaged or planned for the project and where they redirected things.
Well, I think from Rupert's perspective, because he was involved in the development of the question, it wasn't that he really changed direction. He kind of just focused different elements. For example, the background noise, and that was very much came out of a team meeting where we were sat working with him, and this became very evident. In terms of the focus groups, it was more about the usability, I think. So the ideas, the therapy, they actually didn't have much to change. The therapy was pretty standard. But the gamification, the one that jumps out the most is the fact that they just didn't understand the link between the different games and how that was linked to therapy. So we spent most focus groups touching on that a little bit and making sure that was clearer for them.
Yep. I love that it was, the background noise, one of them was the pub.
Yeah.
And I assume that required a trip to the pub to record.
Unfortunately, they were just taken from a database, but yeah, I'm sure we did that.
The other question I had was, it's interesting that, Rupert as a co-investigator had to be interviewed for the grant application process. Obviously you can't speak for him, but what are your thoughts? Is that reasonable for a consumer researcher and for someone particularly who has a communication disability? Do you think it's a positive thing, or is it actually unreasonable?
He didn't have to be. There was no mandate that he would be involved in. So for that particular stream, it wasn't the whole team that had to go. There are streams where it is the whole team. So that would be an interesting and very relevant question there. But he actually suggested that he go, because when we were rehearsing and practicing for our interview, one of the things we talked about was how we make what aphasia is and why it's important. That little bit we all have at the beginning of our grant applications, the impact of aphasia. And that was his suggestion, that if he goes and shows them what aphasia is. I think it has to be dependent on the person. I think it was extremely effective in making the panel, who were relatively lay. I think there was a neurologist on there, but there were gastroenterologists, they were statisticians. They really didn't have much experience of people with aphasia, so it was a very easy way to help them understand. But I don't think you could force someone to be in that situation. Absolutely not.
Yeah, good that it was an optional component then. And as Rupert said, some of them might have Googled aphasia and that's it.
Yeah, exactly.
And the ListenIn app itself, you talked about some of the components within that, how things are weighted for difficulty, concreteness and frequency, I think it was, and others. I'm just interested in how they were weighted within the app and how it twiddled those kind of knobs and variables to make things harder and easier. Was that programmed in? Was that?
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure I'm getting this right, but it does specify in the paper. So I do encourage you to look at the paper as well. But it was what's called a smart algorithm. So it was adapted based on performance at every level. So every trial was contributed to that algorithm. And I think it was 70% or more pushed you up to the next level. And so there was a linear grading that we'd worked out, but it was across different variables. So it was quite complex in the sense that you could go up. And if you've got 70% accurate on one level, that might mean going up on another variable, but staying at that level depending on performance.
So it sounds as though, there wasn't the problem that some software has where there's a low ceiling, that you could kind of turn up the difficulty to quite a high degree. Absolutely.
And the first few blocks that the person did were purely to work out what level they were starting off at.
Yep. There's a question from Robin O'Halloran. She said, thanks, Sonia. That was fantastic. Do you think co-design could support the development of any treatment for people with aphasia?
Great question. My gut instinct on the spot is yes. I can't think of an example where it couldn't. Obviously, app development is an example of where it has to be. Whether it has to be moved for all treatments, I don't know, but I can't see it as a bad thing. I can only see it as a good thing. So yeah.
And the requirement that the gamification, the game wasn't based on the success in the language part of the app. You might have said this, but did that come from the focus groups, or was that a decision from other research?
No, that was a clinical decision. So that was very much something we started with, and we didn't shift on that, but I don't think at any point there was any suggestion that we needed to shift by the people with aphasia, but that was a clinical decision that it should not be about, it should be about engagement. That was why we were using the gamification, not the,
I think we've got time for one last question. This one's from Kira Shiggins. Hi, Sonia, brilliant talk, and thank you to you and Rupert. What would be the top tip you would give to researchers and or clinicians who wish to involve people with aphasia in their research when they are designing or developing their project?
Oh, another good question. My top tip, there's so many, but I think with Rupert, the key thing was that he was involved from the outset. So he wasn't just picked up because we needed to tick that box for a grant application. He really drove the research and the question, and so he was really motivated and committed. He also had a lot of experience and skills that he brought to it. So it was a very genuine collaboration, a very genuine member of the team. So I think that would be my top tip. So get people involved early, and if you come up with a research question, we all liaise with our participants regularly, and we have great discussions, and they have wonderful ideas. So really build on those ideas rather than bringing them in just as the grant is about to be submitted.
Yep, and I suspect that it was funded because they could see it was genuine co-production of research and not a last-minute thing. All right, thank you again, Dr. Brownsett, Mr. Leach, for your presentation. Our next seminar will be Wednesday, the 25th of May. We're very fortunate to hear from Dr. Willemijn Dojens, who will present to us on everyday communication in aphasia rehabilitation. Please join our community of practice if you haven't, or follow us on Twitter or Facebook for further details about that seminar. Thanks again, everyone.